300 miles south of Cairo, on the west bank of the Nile, there is a chamber where the water is winning. 10 granite pillars, cut from stone quarried 250 miles upstream, hold up roof beams weighing close to 100 tons apiece, beams heavier than the largest blocks in the king's chamber at Giza. The joints between the stones are cut so tight that the men who first excavated them said you couldn't slide a knife blade into the seam. There's no mortar anywhere in the structure.
None.
And when the archaeologists who pulled this place out of the mud finished their work, 2 of them refused to believe it belonged to the king whose name was carved on its walls. This is the Osireion at Abydos, and the argument over what it actually is has never really been settled. It's just gone quiet. To understand why this building unsettled the people who found it, you have to understand the ground it sits on. Abydos was sacred to the Egyptians for longer than most civilizations have existed at all. For roughly 3,000 years, it was the center of the cult of Osiris, the god who died, was torn apart, and was reassembled to rule the afterlife. To the Egyptians, this wasn't an abstract myth, it was proof death could be survived. Abydos was believed to be the place where the boundary between the living world and the world of the dead grew thin, and pilgrims crossed the entire country to leave offerings here, hoping proximity to this ground would carry them into the next life. That belief predates the New Kingdom by centuries. Out in the desert behind the site lies a cemetery the Egyptians called Al-Quayab, the mother of pots, named for the sheer volume of broken votive pottery pilgrims left behind. Beneath it are the tombs of Egypt's first dynasty kings from around 3000 BCE, at the very dawn of the pharaonic era. One of those tombs, belonging to a king named Jur, was later reinterpreted by the Egyptians themselves as the actual tomb of Osiris. From that point on, Abydos became one of the great pilgrimage sites of the ancient world for nearly 2,000 years. Given that history, it makes sense that the most spectacular building at Abydos belongs to Seti I, who ruled from around 1290 to 1279 BCE. His temple there is one of the finest surviving monuments of the New Kingdom, walls covered floor to ceiling with exquisite religious reliefs, carvings so fine that the musculature of the figures is still sharp after 3,000 years. It was inside this temple that scholars found the Abydos King List, one of the most important surviving records for reconstructing Egypt's royal succession. None of this is in dispute. Seti built this temple, and the evidence fits everything we know about how New Kingdom Egypt built things. But behind that temple, connected by a long descending corridor, is something else entirely. And once you compare the two, the mismatch is hard to unsee. When Seti's temple was being built, the structure behind it wasn't even visible. It lay buried beneath Nile floodplain silt, its passage descending into a chamber below the local water table. It stayed hidden until 1902 and 1903, when a team from the Egypt Exploration Fund, led by the Swiss Egyptologist Edouard Neville, began digging behind the temple. Working with him, under Flinders Petrie's direction, was a young researcher named Margaret Murray, who documented the site in detail. What they found was a subterranean hall built almost entirely from megaliths, 10 enormous granite pillars in 2 rows, supporting massive horizontal roof beams laid across their tops. The largest of these beams weighs somewhere near 100 tons, not the pillars, the beams, each roughly the mass of a fully loaded locomotive, raised into place with a precision both excavators, veterans of Egyptian stonework, called exceptional even by Egyptian standards. The scale is worth putting in context. The average block in the Great Pyramid at Giza weighs between 2 and 15 tons. The largest blocks anywhere in that pyramid, the granite slabs of the King's Chamber, usually treated as the extreme edge of Old Kingdom engineering, weigh perhaps 50 to 80 tons. The Osireion's roof beams sit at or beyond the top of that entire range, placed in a flooded pit behind a temple built by a pharaoh whose builders, everywhere else we can examine their work, use smaller blocks, mortar joints, and heavily decorated walls. The granite makes the puzzle sharper still. It isn't local, it's Aswan granite, quarried at the Nile's first cataract roughly 250 miles south. Every 100-ton block had to be cut from bedrock, moved to the river, transported that entire distance, and then maneuvered into a chamber below the water table and lifted into place. We know the Egyptians moved heavy stone using barges, sledges, ramps, and levers. That's well documented. But that documentation is richest for stones weighing a few tons to a few dozen tons. At the scale of the Osireions' largest blocks, the exact sequence of operations is something historians largely have to infer rather than read directly from surviving records. Then there's the fit. The blocks of the central hall are laid together with no mortar at all, nothing holding the courses together but the precision of the cut. Murray, examining the joints firsthand, described a tolerance so tight no blade could be worked into the seam. The stones don't look assembled. They look like a single mass of granite sculpted and then separated along invisible lines. That kind of joinery is structural, built into the fabric of the thing, and it was executed to a standard that would be demanding even with modern diamond tools and laser levels. So when Neville and Murray stood in that hall, they were looking at something that didn't match their own deep knowledge of how 19th dynasty builders worked. Neville, a careful, conservative excavator with decades of Egyptian fieldwork behind him, published a genuinely startling conclusion. He argued the structure predated dynastic Egypt altogether. His reasoning was architectural. New Kingdom architecture, and Seti's own temple especially, is defined by dense ornamentation, walls covered in reliefs and hieroglyphic text, an aesthetic so consistent that trained eyes can often date a wall from style alone. The Osireion is the opposite. Austere, its structural blocks carrying no integrated relief work or inscription. To Neville, that didn't read as a stylistic choice by Seti's craftsmen. It read as a different building tradition entirely. There are inscriptions inside the Osireion, passages from the Book of Gates and cartouches naming Seti I and his successor Merneptah, and these are the only elements directly tying the structure to the 19th dynasty. But Neville looked closely at how they were carved and concluded they were additions, cut into surfaces that had never been prepared to receive writing, applied to a monument that was already standing and finished. That distinction matters. In Egyptian architecture, text and structure are normally conceived together, with the wall built partly to hold the inscription. Neville's reading was that someone had come to an existing structure they hadn't built and carved their own name onto it, closer to a later ruler claiming an older monument than to original construction. Margaret Murray reached a similar conclusion independently in her own 1904 publication, cataloging the same anomalies and comparing the construction against everything documented about New Kingdom building. She wasn't a fringe figure. She went on to a long, respected career, remaining active into her 90s before her death at 100. She examined the Osireion firsthand and committed a considered professional judgment to print. The methods didn't match the period. For roughly 2 decades, that's where the question sat. Then, between 1925 and 1930, the archaeologist Henri Frankfurt conducted further excavations, and in 1933 published the study that would define how the Osireion has been understood ever since, a monograph identifying it, in its very title, as the cenotaph of Seti I at Abydos. Frankfurt's argument was that Seti did build the structure, but deliberately in an archaic style. The plainness and resemblance to something ancient was intentional theology, not evidence of an older builder. Seti's actual burial lay elsewhere, in the Valley of the Kings. This was a symbolic tomb built to evoke the primordial waters of creation and the mythical tomb of Osiris. Even the flooding, in this reading, wasn't accidental. It represented Nun, the primordial ocean from which all life emerged. That interpretation is elegant, and it's become the accepted scholarly position because it resolves every anomaly at once. The style looks pre-dynastic because it was designed to, it's plain because plainness served the symbolism, and it floods because the water was meant to carry meaning. It's the explanation in nearly every modern account of the site, and most Egyptologists today treat it as settled. But it's worth being precise about what actually happened in that shift. Neville and Murray's original assessment wasn't disproven by new evidence. No inscription was later found integrated into the original fabric. No construction technique surfaced tying the megalithic joinery to documented 19th dynasty methods elsewhere. What changed is that Frankfurt offered a more comfortable interpretation, one that returned the building neatly into the known chronology, and the field moved toward it. That doesn't make Frankfurt wrong. Archaeizing monuments for religious effect is a documented Egyptian practice, and his reading remains the well-supported mainstream view. But the original excavators' specific observations were set aside rather than technically refuted, and they're rarely mentioned today. A few outside voices have tried to reopen the question since, and it's worth being honest about where that stands. In 1992, a geologist argued that erosion patterns on the enclosure walls around the Great Sphinx looked like they'd been caused by centuries of heavy rainfall Giza hasn't seen in roughly 5,000 years, and used that to suggest the Sphinx, and structures like the Osireion, might belong to a much older, unknown building tradition. That idea was later expanded well beyond the original claim into popular theories about a lost global civilization. To be clear, this remains a fringe position. Most geologists and Egyptologists reject the rainfall erosion argument, pointing instead to groundwater effects, salt weathering, and soft local limestone, and no accepted dating method has placed the Osireion or the Sphinx enclosure outside the dynastic period. Treating that theory as established fact would be inaccurate, but dismissing it without engaging the actual stonework doesn't fully answer Neville and Murray's original, documented observations either. Both things are true. The fringe theory isn't supported, and the anomalies they recorded were real and remain only partially explained by archaeizing alone. One more voice belongs in this, far older than any modern debate. A Greek geographer traveling through Egypt in the 1st century BCE described a remarkable structure at Abydos as already ancient, already weathered, already a relic of the deep past in his own time, 2,000 years before ours. He didn't attribute it to Seti or to anyone else. To him, it was simply old. And the water keeps rising. Since the Aswan High Dam was completed in 1970, the water table across this stretch of the Nile has climbed, deepening the flooding inside the Osireion's central chamber. The finished stone surfaces the first excavators photographed and described are increasingly submerged, salt-stained, and harder to study every year. Modern tools, photogrammetry, precise mass measurement, structural modeling haven't settled the attribution question either way. Mostly, they've confirmed just how unusual the engineering really is. So, here's where the evidence actually leaves us. A structure two of its most careful original excavators believed predated dynastic Egypt, based on direct inspection. An attribution to Seti I resting on inscriptions that appear, by those same excavators' account, to have been added after construction. A building style matching nothing else documented in the New Kingdom, a few dozen feet from a temple that perfectly represents everything the New Kingdom was known for. And a mainstream explanation, the deliberate cenotaph theory, that's well-reasoned and widely accepted, yet still doesn't fully explain why the joinery needed to be engineered to a precision so far beyond symbolic necessity. Maybe that precision was the point, a display of skill meant to honor Osiris with the finest stonework Egypt could produce, style included. Or maybe there's something in the construction sequence we still don't have quite right. That's the honest state of the question, and it's more interesting than a settled answer would be. Look again at those joints, at blocks heavier than anything the pyramid builders were setting 1,000 years earlier, and decide for yourself which explanation earns your confidence. Tell me in the comments. And if there's another site where the textbook answer stops making sense the moment you read the actual excavation reports, name it below, because that's exactly where we're going next.